Yeah, so today I am going to be helping you to trick people into thinking that you are smart, specifically when it comes to talking about books. And that is because I feel like this is my public service. This is my duty. As a full-time book critic, booktuber, book talker, it's basically my full-time job to talk about books, but also to convince people that I know what I'm talking about. Basically, I trick people into thinking that I'm smart for a living. So I thought that today I would share that wisdom because there is not a single thing I'm more qualified to talk about than this. And people often tell me that they love reading, they love consuming literature, but the second that someone asks them about one of the books that they've been reading, their brain just kind of goes blank. Like smooth brain, head empty, no thoughts, just vibes. And I totally understand that. I completely empathize with that struggle, but I think that it is actually something you can get better at. Reading itself is a muscle that I think you can train, but I also think that talking about books is something you can improve on. So today I'm going to be covering the following topics. Number one, how to take in what you are reading. Number two, how to remember what you read. Thirdly, what to consider when you are reading a book, what to be thinking about actively while you read. Four is how to thoughtfully review the books that you consume. Five, how you can improve your vocabulary when you're talking about books. And finally, books I think that everyone should read in order to be able to engage in bookish conversation. Like the books that I think are referenced most often intertextually in other books, but also in literary conversations and dialogue and discourse. And also more generally in pop culture too. So this is kind of like a cheat reading list to be able to contribute to these conversations as soon as possible, basically. So we have a lot of ground to cover, but I hope that this is useful. And I'm also absolutely thrilled to let you know that today's video is kindly brought to you by Book of the Month. And this is one of my favorite ways to find thought-provoking books that I can read and talk about in the first place. Book of the Month is an online book service with readers in mind. They promote emerging authors and help you to find your next favorite book. Their team of book lovers go through hundreds of fiction titles in order to find the 5 best books that they recommend each month. So this is a really curated list, and you can pick the one that piques your interest the most and choose to have either a hardcover sent to you in the post in one of these snazzy blue boxes, or the new thing that Book of the Month are doing, which is so cool, is you can actually get the book as an audiobook. So you can download it and listen to it in the app. My pick for November 2023 was this one. This is Let Us Descend by Jessamine Ward, and this follows an enslaved girl in America just before the Civil War, so I was really intrigued by this. And I wouldn't have found this book if it wasn't for Book of the Month. They can get you an absolute bargain on new release fiction, and in fact you can get your first hardcover book or audiobook for just $9.99 using the discount code GOBBLE, because, you know, it's Thanksgiving, and I'm thankful for great fiction. So if you want to spend less time researching and more time actually reading, my link for Book of the Month is down below in the description box, check it out, and a huge thank you to Book of the Month for making this video happen. So, first and foremost, how do you make sure that you're actually taking in what you are reading? For me, when I finish like a reading session, I try to pause and take a minute or two just to absorb what I just consumed. It is so important to let ideas marinate. It's like letting your dinner go down, you know? If you immediately open your phone or your laptop and start scrolling, you will immediately forget most of what you just read, most of the detail and the texture and the bits that you really enjoyed when you were actually reading it. You're gonna get like intellectual whiplash because you're just being bombarded with information immediately. So stop to consider what you just read, whether you read 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 pages, just take a moment to let it settle in your brain. And I think that time spent reflecting on what you've just read is just as important as the time you spent reading it. That thinking time is key. The other issue I think that people encounter is they read like 5 pages of a book and then realize they actually forgot to pay attention to any of it. They didn't take in any of the details, and you realize you don't actually know what just happened, even though your eyes were physically scanning the words. And so the way I rectified this personally is that I always read with a pen in my hand. Literally just tracing the words with the pen, or even just with your finger, immediately makes you focus on the words in the sentence you are reading without like skimming ahead. And this was something I really used when I was revising for my exams. I would actually get a piece of cardboard and cover up everything else on the page that I'm yet to read and just take it one line at a time. So I'm actually really absorbing and paying close attention to the line I am currently reading. And trust me, it makes such a difference. And I think I've kind of trained my brain now to just focus on what's right in front of me and not kind of skimming ahead a little bit. But the reason I now choose a pen specifically for this is because I also really like to annotate, and this is another thing that helps me take in what I'm reading. I underline my favorite quotes for 2 reasons. Firstly, because I think it makes me pay attention to every single word, because the fact that I could underline something, not necessarily that I'm going to, but the fact that I could means that I'm actually really focusing on each line and also on each individual word as well. And the second reason is a bit more sentimental. I think that a physical book tells two stories. One is the story that is printed on the page in black and white that the author wrote for you, and then the other is the story of you reading it. And so I underline things, I highlight my favorite passages, I've circled certain words, and that's because if someone were to pick up a book from my collection, they could flick through that book and immediately see all of the moments that resonated specifically with me, the moments that I really connected with personally, and I think that's really, really special. But if you don't like the idea of actually writing in the book itself, because I know that sometimes when I tell people that I annotate my books, they look at me like I just told them that I like to tread on puppies in my free time. Like, they are horrified. If you don't want to actually do that, read with a notebook alongside you, write down your favorite quotes in there. Use post-it notes, use sticky tabs to mark out specific pages. Type out your favorite quotes, make notes. I think what I'm trying to say is be an active reader. Don't just passively scan the page, be active, be thinking about the ideas that are being presented to you. Think about the writing and the quality of that writing. And for me, that's really crucial to taking in all of the words on the page. And the final thing I'll say on this is look up the definition of words that you don't understand. I know this sounds obvious, but for a long time I didn't do this, and I feel like I missed out on so much meaning. This helps me to stay engaged because it means that things aren't just going over my head, because authors choose very specific words for very specific reasons. You know, each word has a nuanced meaning and it was chosen for a reason. And so if I'm not familiar with that word, I look it up and then I can appreciate what they're trying to tell me. I know that Kindles and e-readers make this especially easy because you can just like hold down the word and it will give you the definition. But it's also a great way to just expand your vocabulary and be better at reviewing and talking and being conversational, because it allows you to be more accurate with what you are trying to convey. Plus, honestly, this is a great long-term investment into being great at crosswords. So you're welcome. Next, how to remember what you read. There's this great quote by Emerson where he says, "I cannot remember the books I have read any more than the meals I have eaten. Even so, they have made me." And yet, I don't think it needs to be that way. My superpower, I think, is that I have an encyclopedic knowledge of all of the books that I have read. I have like a library of books in my head, and I'm on track to read about 200 books this year, which I know is unhinged, but if you quizzed me on any of those books, I genuinely would be able to tell you what they were about and what I thought of each one. And I want to teach you how to be able to do the same. The reason for this is because I review books. It's because I write notes as I go, it's because I sum up my feelings at the end, and then I write myself a review. And often I share those with you guys. And what I've realized over time is that while I may not remember every single small detail of the 500-page book I just read, what I've essentially memorized is my review of that book. I guess what I've done is essentially memorized how I would explain this book to someone who hasn't yet read it, how I would review it, what my thoughts were about the book. And then of course there will be scenes or details or specific characters that stay with me forever, but I would say most of what I remember of the book is my review. And so that's like when someone asks me, "Oh, have you read Love in the Big City?" When I tell them, yes, I have, I'm basically recalling my 100 to 200 word review rather than trying to remember the 90,000 words that are in the book. Does that make sense? So I basically have like a summary of the plot, and most importantly, a summary of my thoughts on the book, kind of locked and loaded in my head. Professor Pierre Bayard, who is the author of How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read, identifies the importance of writing notes and writing reviews of the books that you do read. He says, once forgetfulness has set in, you can use your notes to rediscover your opinion of the author and their work at the time of your original reading, like blazes on a trail that are intended to show the way during future periods of amnesia. And so this is why I take notes, I write reviews, and I annotate the books, because those are the things that remind me what I thought about the book without having to reread the whole thing. And you can log your reviews on Goodreads or the Storygraph, which are book social media. And of course, you don't have to make your account public if you don't want to. You can keep it just for yourself or for your friends. You can review things anonymously if you want, but I think the act of writing the review helps me to remember it. Alternatively, if you don't want to use social media, you could use a physical reading journal, a notebook. You can log things on Notion, which I think is a really useful organizational tool. It's a website, and that kind of gives you like a digital record as well, which is easier to search. And the important thing is to return back to these reviews, reread what you wrote and challenge yourself, think about what you thought. I think part of the reason I have such a great memory of the books that I've read is because I read the book, I write my review, then I'll probably make a YouTube video where I will regurgitate that review, then I edit the video so I hear it again, and then I watch the video back and I hear it again. So that's just basic repetition, because by that point I've consumed the exact wording of my review like 5 times. And that means that if I'm out to dinner tonight and someone asks me what I thought of Love in the Big City, I will remember what I thought about that book, rather than just being able to go, yeah, it was good, you know? Because you're not really saying anything when you just say, yeah, it was good, it was okay, it was fine. And that leads me on to talking about how to review books, because because it is much more intellectual to be able to say why you enjoyed a book rather than just saying, yes, I enjoyed it, or no, I did not enjoy it. The most important thing for me is to think about, did the author achieve what they set out to do? Think about author intention as well as your subjective response to the author's work. Whether I liked the book or not is always kind of secondary for me. What comes first is, did the author achieve what they intended to do? And the next most important thing for me is to always ask yourself, why? I would rather someone gave me a detailed reasoning as to why they hated my favorite book than someone saying, yeah, I read your favorite book and I thought it was good. But like, why did you think it was good? What about it made it good? Or alternatively, what about it did you not like? Why did you not like it? That, for me, is the interesting bit, not whether you liked it or not. So be specific, you know, if you found the book boring, was that because the pacing was too slow, or was it because you didn't resonate with the subject area? Because those are two very different things. So like, what was it that didn't appeal to you? What was it that made you lose interest, lose focus? Why did you not like it? And then expanding on that and going back to author intention, did the author do those things intentionally, deliberately? You know, if they made the pace slow, was that because they were trying to build up a kind of atmosphere? Was that a fundamental part of their storytelling? So I always challenge myself to think, why did I not like this thing? Rather than just, did I like it or not? And then the follow-up question to that is, what could have been done differently to make me like it more? So for example, maybe there were too many peripheral side characters who didn't feel necessary or weren't developed enough to warrant being part of the book. One thing I always pick up on is when an author tells you, oh yeah, these two characters are best friends, but we never see the friendship, we never see the softness or the intimacy of that bond. And that's one of my like pet peeves in literature, when they tell you rather than showing you. I want to see like a cute little anecdote of that friendship. And without that, I don't really feel like it's believable. Just because the author told me something doesn't mean I believe it to be true. And so that's something I always challenge myself to think about when I'm reading a book, is how would I improve this? You know, if this was delivered to me as a manuscript, as a draft, and I was being asked for constructive criticism or feedback, what would I tell the author? What would I say, I think you could improve on? How could this be made into a better book? And I think asking yourself that question means that you're being more thoughtful and considerate of the work that has been put in front of you, and immediately your commentary is so much more interesting. Now, I'll talk about things to consider when you're reading in a moment, but while we're talking about reviews, I also wanted to address the flip side of this, which is reading other people's reviews, whether that's in a newspaper, whether that's in a literary journal, or whether that's just on social media or Goodreads. I personally would try not to read anyone else's review until I have formed my opinion. I want to make sure that I've established my opinion and my thoughts first, so that then when I come to reading other people's reviews, which I really love to do, I am engaging with those reviews critically, and I'm thinking, do I agree with this or not? And if not, why not? So to give you an example, someone might read the book Boy Parts by Eliza Clark, and they might think, oh, this character wasn't that likable. They weren't a morally good person, and therefore they hated the book because they didn't like the character. But maybe I read the book and I liked that that character was flawed. I liked that they were a little bit messy. I liked that they felt real. And I feel that that was actually the author's intention, to write a character who was not perfect. And that is the beauty of reacting to art, that we all have a different response. And that's where thought-provoking discussions happen, in which no one is right, no one is wrong, but we can have a healthy conversation where we share our different opinions on the piece of art and our different responses to it. That's not only okay, it's actively encouraged. So, what should you consider when reading a book? I feel like this is the big one. So I'm gonna go through a couple things that I am always keeping like in the back of my mind when I approach a novel. Firstly, perspective. Who is telling the story? Are they a reliable narrator? Do we trust what they say? Is the story told from the first, second, or third person perspective? The first person, I, is vulnerable, it's intimate, it's soul-bearing. It means that a lot of the time we're moving through the action at the same pace as the main character. We know what they know. On the flip side, if a first person narrator withholds something from the reader, doesn't tell us something that they know but we don't, then that is an unreliable narrator. Meanwhile, a second person narrator addresses the reader as you. This is really hard to pull off. I think a book that does it exceptionally well is Open Water, and this can have the impact of being very direct and poignant. Like, we as the reader are the collective you that they are speaking to. And that makes for a very, very immersive experience. Then the other style of perspective we can have is third person. That is much more omniscient. It kind of looks at what's happening and unfolding from a bird's eye view and talks about what every character is individually kind of going through. One really interesting way of using the third person is through what's called free indirect discourse, which basically moves that we move freely between different perspectives. Someone who does this really, really well is Jane Austen, and more recently, Sally Rooney uses it in Normal People, in which Connell and Marianne are both miscommunicating, but as the reader, we're in both of their heads, so we empathize with both of them. And I think that is really, really fascinating. Now, the next thing that I would consider whenever I'm reading a book is the pacing. So is the book fast, medium, or slow paced, and how does that impact the narrative? Books like Ponyboy or Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl are very fast paced because they're episodic, they tell lots of different anecdotes and stories, and they're building up a kind of chaotic atmosphere where life is moving really, really fast. On the other hand, we have books like Franny and Zooey or Greek Lessons, which mostly are just conversations that happen in only a handful of settings, and they're slow paced because they're more of a meditation on a set of ideas. So we're not meant to be focusing on plot, we're meant to be focusing on the intellectual arguments and thoughts that are being invoked. They're an exploration of a character's headspace or the dynamics between specific characters. So the question I ask myself is, how does this choice of pacing add to the overall impact of the book? Then, the next thing I would consider would be tone. What is the tone of the book? Really Good Actually and Romantic Comedy are books that are intended to be funny. They're full of sardonic, dry wit and humor, and the tone is pretty sarcastic and self-deprecating because that is the narrator's headspace. That's what they're going through, that's how they feel. Whereas some books are more informative and educational. Others are melancholy and sad, like The Remains of the Day or The Bell Jar. Then you have books like The Stranger, which are existential. Or an interesting one would be Crime and Punishment, because the character in the book is very kind of nihilistic, but it's clear from reading it that the author themselves is not nihilistic. He kind of promotes more of a utilitarian idea. So sometimes the tone or the attitude of the main character is being mocked by the writer. It could be being scrutinized or criticized, and so I think you can kind of try and pick up on things like that, and that creates for a really interesting analysis or conversation. Another thing to ask yourself is, who is the intended audience for this? Because that means that even if you didn't like this book, who do you think would like this book? Maybe it's a young adult book, like Heartstopper, for example. Maybe if you're in your mid-30s, this book does not reflect the kinds of relationships that you have, and maybe that means it doesn't resonate with you, but it's important to be able to identify who it would be able to resonate with. So maybe even if it didn't connect with you, you can identify who would really benefit from reading it, and maybe that's a teenager at school. Just because the themes or ideas didn't resonate with you, that doesn't mean it's not a good book. It might resonate with someone else, and also maybe it wasn't intended for you. Maybe it wasn't written for you, or with you in mind. And that would also lead me to think about genre. How does this book conform to its chosen genre, whether that's fantasy or romance or sci-fi or western? How does it conform? How does it deviate? Those two things are really interesting and always intentional. It's also important context for understanding the book too. How does this book communicate with other books in its genre? I also like to consider style. So did I like the writing style? I personally really respond well to very elaborate, kind of embellished writing, so lots of metaphors and similes and analogies. A book like This Is How You Lose the Time War or by Grand Central Station, I sat down and wept. But I appreciate that not everyone likes books like those as much as I do. I would say that a good book that combines both pretty writing and a heavy plot would be The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and that's why I recommend this book to anyone trying to get back into reading. But what I'm trying to say is, instead of saying, yeah, I liked that book, or no, I didn't like that book, you can say, I think what I didn't like about that book was the writing style, because it was a little too simple and not very embellished. You're just adding a layer of depth to what you're saying. And then the next thing I would consider would be structure. So structure is the order of which the story is told. So is it told in a linear, chronological way, or are there time jumps? You know, does it start with a murder scene and then the rest of the book is leading up to the murder? Do we start already, you know, like balls deep in the action in a book like Chain Gang All-Stars, which opens with a fight scene and then the world building happens from there? Or do we start in a more quiet and subdued way in books like A Little Luck by Claudia Pinheiro? This book starts slow but then builds up to a crescendo of action. There's a huge climax. And I personally prefer the latter style because I like to really get to know a character character before shit hits the fan, and so I'm kind of really rooting for them. Now, there are lots of other things that you can consider that I don't have time to touch on every single thing in this video. So I would think of things like setting, like time frame, like historical context, like political context or political meaning, whether the story is an allegory for something else or not. That just means whether there's kind of a deeper meaning to it. For example, Animal Farm is ostensibly a story about a bunch of farmyard animals, but beneath the surface, it is a story about the Russian Revolution and a criticism of that. I also just read a book called Study for Obedience, which is on the surface a book about feeling isolated, but really it's an allegory for ever being a misfit or cast out from society in any possible way. It's about otherness, it's about alienation, and it's about the things that separate us from the crowd. And the final thing I wanted to specifically mention is characterization. How are the characters brought to life? Through descriptions, through dialogue, through writing style, through their voice. I think a great example of this would be Demon Copperhead, which tells the story of a poor boy in Virginia, and every single simile, description, metaphor, analogy, anecdote is exactly what that boy would be thinking. You really, really feel like you are inside that boy's head and no one else's. It's all about how that specific character perceives the world. And then you also have books like The Catcher in the Rye, where the character describes lots of things as lousy. In fact, the opening line is, if you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born, and what my lousy childhood was like, and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me, and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. So you can see here how a character is instantly being created here through writing style. Another example would be in Slaughterhouse-Five, where every time death is addressed, the character says, and so it goes. So it goes is used every single time death or mortality is referenced, and that's basically to give you the impression that he is totally desensitized to war because he was a prisoner of war. Now let's touch on some vocabulary you can use when discussing books and how you can improve the way that you talk about literature. This can be minor changes, like I said before, just paying attention to word choices that authors use as you're reading. So maybe instead of saying that you couldn't put the book down, you might describe it as captivating or engrossing, spellbinding, mesmerizing, enthralling. You know, reading more helps you to improve your vocabulary. And that is why I always write down and research the words that I didn't already know when reading books, because it equips you with better ways to describe the exact sentiment that you feel at a later date. You could also talk about how we build up to the climax of the story. You can talk about specific literary devices, like I mentioned before, the word allegory, which means there's a story disguising a deeper meaning, or a fable is usually a pretty straightforward, simple story about people or animals that actually conveys some kind of moral lesson. You can question whether things are explicit or whether they are implicit. Explicit just means that it's made obvious and clear, whereas implicit means that it is implied, but not necessarily plainly expressed. Another good word is the connotations of what you were reading. So what ideas or feelings did the words invoke in you? Where do they take you? What does it make you feel? How is equilibrium disrupted or restored? That just basically means like the neutral state where everything is fine. So a popular narrative style is that we start with equilibrium, everything's okay, then it's disrupted, and then the hero saves the day and equilibrium is restored. We're back to normal. One word that I love, that I use all the time, is ostensible. And ostensibly just means that something appears to be true, like on the surface, but isn't necessarily the full story. So there's something more complex happening when you dive deeper. I also love juxtaposition, cracking word. So for example, in a hockey romance like Icebreaker, you have a delicate, dainty figure skater juxtaposed with a big, burly, brutish hockey player. When the two meet, this is a juxtaposition because the two people contrast each other. And when two wildly contrasting things are put side by side, it encourages us to think about what makes them different, but also what makes them the same. A word I think I probably used in like every literature essay at university ever is dichotomy. And a dichotomy is basically just when two things are represented as being polar opposite. So like good versus evil. So in the book that you're reading, how are dichotomies complicated or reinforced by the author? So for example, Professor Snape in Harry Potter. Snape is initially perceived as being pure evil in opposition to Harry Potter, who is pure good. But the dichotomy of hero and villain is complicated when Snape turns out to be actually not as evil as we thought he was. Often art disrupts dichotomies, and that's really, really interesting to me. We could also borrow a term from Aristotle, which is catharsis. If the book is cathartic, it basically means that it represents really intense emotions in order to make you feel purged or cleansed afterwards. So an example of that might be like Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare, where pretty much every character dies at the end. Spoiler alert, by the way. I mean, you've had hundreds of years to read that. I'm sure you already know what happens in Romeo and Juliet, but yeah, that's a tragedy. And after watching and experiencing the really intense emotions that the characters feel, you also go through those emotions, but they have no consequence to your actual life. So after finishing it, you can leave all those emotions behind and you feel kind of cleansed. Speaking about death, if the story is an elegy, that basically means that it laments someone who has died and kind of pays tribute to them and their life. If the book is dystopian, that means that it talks about a society where there is great injustice or suffering, like in a book like The Handmaid's Tale or 1984. Or the opposite of that would be a utopia. That's where everything is like perfect or perceived to be. Is there an element of irony, which basically means that we as the reader understand something that the character does not? We could also call the hero of the story our protagonist instead of just character. And also, one that I love is eponymous protagonist, which basically just means that the main character of the book is also the title of the book. So like Dracula, Jane Eyre, Rebecca, Ethan Frome, those are all eponymous characters. Was the narrator reliable? Were they omniscient? Omniscient just means that they were all-seeing. And I also think it's interesting to distinguish between the writer and the narrative voice, because sometimes a character does not reflect the writer's own feelings and sentiments. A good example of this would be Lolita, which is a very commonly misunderstood book because it's written from the perspective of a paedophile. But of course, we are meant to condemn him and to think he's awful. And that is made clear through the way that the book is written. You could question whether the book feels cliche. So is it something you kind of feel has been done before? Does it rely too much on stereotypes or archetypes? Character archetypes are basically just like hero, villain, sidekick, femme fatale, clown, that kind of thing. And then we also have some kind of bookish references that are spoken about in like popular discourse. So people may reference a Faustian bargain. This is in reference to Dr. Faustus. And a Faustian bargain is a pact that is made whereby a person trades something of supreme moral or spiritual importance, and they trade that for some material benefit. So for example, trading your soul for knowledge or power or riches, that's a Faustian bargain. Or if a character is Machiavellian, that comes from Machiavelli's The Prince, and that just means someone who is cunning or unscrupulous, scheming, especially in their politics. So someone like Iago in Othello by Shakespeare. We also have the idea of the Scarlet Letter. If you've seen the film Easy A, you'll know what I'm talking about. This comes from Nathaniel Hawthorne's book, The Scarlet Letter. And if someone has to wear a scarlet letter, that was basically the A symbol for adultery. You also have like wearing an albatross around your neck. That's a reference to Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Wearing an albatross around your neck basically means that it's something that undesirable that you have to do, something that haunts you because of a crime that you committed. Someone who displays Jekyll and Hyde characteristics basically just means they're kind of like duplicitous. They kind of display two different sides to their personality or character or nature, and that's because Jekyll and Hyde are actually the same person. And so those literary references lead me to the final part of this video, which is books that I think you can read that people reference the most in everyday conversation and pop culture. They've kind of become part of like popular idioms and phrases. So this is kind of a mini reading list if you want to do pretty much the bare minimum. Firstly, Kafka's The Metamorphosis. People often describe things as Kafka-esque when it is bizarre and kind of makes you feel powerless. Then we have Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm. The former is where we get terms like Big Brother, Room 101. The latter is an allegory. And people often describe things as Orwellian when they feel they are being controlled by surveillance or some sort of totalitarian state. Books like The Great Gatsby and Lolita are referenced so regularly in pop culture, whether that's like a song by Lana Del Rey or Taylor Swift. I think the same for Lord of the Flies. I think that everyone should read a Jane Austen book at some point. I would probably recommend Pride and Prejudice for its kind of cultural significance, but my personal preference would be Emma. Greek mythology is having this huge resurgence right now. I think a lot of people make reference to Greek myths and legends. So you could read Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey, but actually Stephen Fry is writing these kind of like Greek mythological modern retellings, and mythos is a really good place to start. Just because so many authors will reference Greek mythology just in passing as part of a metaphor or something, and having a bit of an awareness of Greek mythology is really, really helpful. For Shakespeare, if you want to read a tragedy, I would say like Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet are probably the ones that are most referenced in my opinion. And then for a comedy, I would probably read like A Midsummer Night's Dream. Frankenstein, I think people reference this a lot. When you create something terrible, you might refer to it as your Frankenstein's monster. And also, key point here is that Frankenstein is the scientist, not the monster. The Catcher in the Rye and The Bell Jar are kind of the modern American classics. Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, The Telltale Heart, The Raven, I feel like they're very often referenced. And then finally, poets. I would say a good place to start would be reading some stuff by Yeats, Whitman, Plath, Blake, Shakespeare, and Milton. So I hope that is useful. Also, like, rogue little side tip is that when you're speaking, you often sound more smart if you remove those filler words that you might accidentally be including in every sentence. So like, and just saying you know? Someone said to me when I was presenting for the BBC that you're actually better to leave a gap instead of saying like or because it sounds like you're thinking, because it slows down what you're saying a little bit, and it also makes you sound more confident in what you're saying. So that was also a little tip that I picked up along the way, and you'll notice that I never really do that anymore. So this has been my guide as to how to sound smart when you talk about books, with just a few little tips and tricks and hacks. I hope it helps. I hope you feel confident now when you go into conversations to talk about literature. And thank you so much for watching this video. Give it a like if you liked it. If you like, you can subscribe for more from me down below. I've got tons of book videos on my channel if you want to work out which book you should read first. But until next time, all the best, stay in touch, have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you very soon. Bye bye!